With no direct talks on the table, the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran continues. And the fallout is felt by all. But as Iranian leaders meet their counterparts from Moscow and Muscat, some are asking if the center of gravity is shifting away from Islamabad and whether bilateral agreements can ensure a return to normality in the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. After 8 weeks, it's strange not to have the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran covering every headline. The shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner had that dubious distinction for the last 2 days. But make no mistake, the war, with its blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, is still wreaking havoc on the world. Direct talks many had hoped would take place in Islamabad didn't happen, but Iran has sent a proposal to the U.S. for consideration. And now, much of the focus is on bilateral discussions taking place between Iran and Russia, as well as with Oman. Here's a look.
As negotiations falter, fuel prices surge. The Iranian foreign minister steps out in St Petersburg on Monday after a weekend of shuttle diplomacy that included stops in both Pakistan and Oman. Mediated negotiations were expected to take place in Islamabad, but the US president cancelled American participation at the last minute. On Saturday, Trump said he would accept a call at any time from Iranian authorities, but deemed it a waste of time for the US to send envoys on long journeys for what he described as an Iranian proposal that was already not good enough.
So we'll deal by telephone, and they can call us anytime they want. Again, we have all the cards. They have no military left, practically. They have no leaders left. We don't know who the leaders are. Nobody knows who the leaders are. I don't think they know who the leaders are, very importantly.
But according to the Iranian foreign minister, it was the US's demands that were unacceptable, leading to a breakdown in talks.
The US approaches caused the previous round of negotiations, despite progress, to fail to reach its goals because of the excessive demands and incorrect policies. It was therefore necessary to hold consultations with our friends in Pakistan to review the latest situation. Thank God, the visit was very positive, and we reviewed what had transpired and the conditions under which the negotiations could continue.
Araghchi had travelled to Pakistan before Donald Trump cancelled US participation and met with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif before travelling onwards to Oman. Oman borders the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point for a fifth of the world's oil exports, which has been effectively blockaded by Iran. In a post on X, Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi said he held good discussions with Abbas Araghchi about the Strait of Hormuz and spoke about a shared responsibility to the international community to address an urgent humanitarian need to free seafarers stuck in the strait. Despite Iran's suggestion Oman could share responsibility in charging tolls, Oman has firmly opposed Iran's proposal to place a levy on passing ships. Since the start of the war, hundreds of ships have been unable or unwilling to transit through the waterway for fear of attack. As of late April, around 2,400 seafarers remain stranded on over 105 tankers in the Persian Gulf, unable to pass through the waterway and facing dwindling supplies.
Our ship has been here almost 1 month now. On the day we docked, on March 3rd, there was already a drone attack. We didn't know where it was coming from, but we got information that it was from Iran. It exploded near an oil tank close to our ship.
Ships run the risk of being attacked if they don't pay Iran a so-called toll, or may be seized by the US naval blockade if suspected of paying that same toll. Elsewhere, Israel strikes at Lebanon in ongoing ceasefire violations. A ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon was a condition Iran demanded from the US. With oil prices surging, many countries around the world are desperate for a ceasefire. However, it appears that both the US and Iran remain far from any agreement.
So if the U.S. and Iran are so far apart, is another approach to ending the war and opening the Strait of Hormuz possible? Joining me now to debate that and much more are, from Washington, retired U.S. Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, Lawrence Wilkerson, and from Geneva, Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group, Ali Vaez. Thanks both so much for being with me. Ali, it's really interesting to see the latest lines about what talks are taking place, not focused on Islamabad, but instead on meetings in St. Petersburg and in Oman. Do you think this is a temporary deviation? Is it complementary? Or is it a serious change in approach?
It's great to be with you again. I think it is a change in approach from the Iranian perspective because they have come to the conclusion that the U.S. is still sticking to a set of maximalist demands when it gets to the nuclear issue, and therefore getting a nuclear deal that would result in lifting of sanctions. I think the Iranians are increasingly cynical about the prospect of that. And so now they're trying to turn the clock back to February 28th, the beginning of this war, where they had serious differences with the United States about the future of their nuclear program. But the Strait of Hormuz was open, and we didn't have this double blockade situation. So they want to use negotiations about the future framework for managing the Strait of Hormuz also as a litmus test to see if on an issue that there is much more common ground with the United States, there is the possibility of any kind of agreement or not.
So if this is the new approach, Ali, what do you see coming out of it?
Well, my understanding is that the U.S. position in the first round of talks in Islamabad has been that either the strait is open to freedom of navigation for everyone, or that there is a framework in which the U.S. is also involved. This creates the situation probably for some sort of a consortium to manage the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which could be comprised of Iran and other countries that are littoral states to the Gulf, like Iraq and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, potentially with the involvement of the United States or other great powers, because at the end of the day, whatever solution you come up with, it has to basically not be a violation of international law, which means that the UN Security Council has to approve it. And second, it has to be temporary so that it doesn't set a precedent for other critical choke points in the world. And that would require difficult negotiations, which the Iranians are putting in terms of sequencing as the first step towards maybe more agreements with the United States on nuclear or other issues.
Okay. Colonel Wilkerson, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what you think then Moscow's role is in all this. If there's, a change in approach and Iran is seeking more kind of bilateral ways to move forward with something that's more beneficial for them in the Strait of Hormuz, for example, where does Moscow really stand?
I think there are two aspects to this, and let me just back up for a second and tell you what I think about Abbas Araghchi. I've come to believe that, like Wang Yi in China and like Sergei Lavrov in Russia, he is probably one of the 3 or 4 most astute diplomats on the face of the earth right now. And that's saying something because we don't have any equivalent. So whatever he is doing, I watch it closely. I listen to him closely. And all to say that I think the trip to Oman, the trip to Pakistan were more or less mechanics. I think the trip to Russia is probably twofold. One, to demonstrate once again to the United States that Araghchi can go and talk with Putin whenever he desires, and Putin will accept it and talk with him. I think that's part of it. Another part of it is probably ensuring that Russia is still with Iran on the critical matters that it has thus far been with them on. At the same time, I know the president here, just escaping a near miss, if you will, is really worried about 1 May and the vote in the Congress, or the discussion in the Congress that must happen at that time under the War Powers Resolution, because he has to tell them what he's going to do, and he has to sell them on what he's going to do. And while that might have been very easy several months ago, it's not going to be so easy this time around, because even Republicans now, and certainly many Democrats, are very much eager to hear what Donald Trump has to say about the progress of a war, which seems to be demonstrating anything but progress.
Yeah, not an enviable position. But Ali, I'm wondering what you make of, being Iranian yourself, what you make of Colonel Wilkerson's thoughts on Iran's top diplomat and how he holds up to the others at the table, especially the Americans. I mean, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, these aren't seasoned negotiators in the geopolitical sense at all.
Right. I think he's absolutely right that Araghchi is a very experienced diplomat. He's been involved in nuclear negotiations now for literally about 20 years, and he knows the issue inside out. However, he's not a decision maker. He is an implementer within the Iranian system. This is why those who think that some of his statements might be freelancing or might indicate that the more hardline elements within the Iranian regime, like the Revolutionary Guards, are not on the same page as Araghchi, are mistaken. Because Araghchi would never freelance, would never go on a limb and take a position that is not tightly coordinated with the deep state in Iran, which is now basically dominated by the Revolutionary Guards. I do believe that one of the things that Araghchi is discussing in Moscow, in St. Petersburg with the Russians, is also the question of what happens to the stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which we know that the U.S. wanted to be shipped out of Iran. The Iranians wanted to dilute on their own soil and not to send it abroad. But a compromise solution that apparently through Pakistani mediation they were close to was to basically do a mixture of both of those approaches. And for the Iranians, sending the material to a third country, Russia would be the country of choice, as was the case in the implementation of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Okay,
I'm being told we can actually welcome a third panelist now. He's joining us from London. Ali Alizadeh is a political commentator and analyst. Sorry, Ali, thanks for being with us. I hope you can hear me clearly. We were discussing the potential for bilateral talks to seed some sort of results in unblockading the Strait of Hormuz, as well as trying to bring an end to this war. We already discussed a little bit about the meetings in Moscow, but there's also Oman as a factor, and Iran has said that its neighbors are a priority here, that Iran wants what's best for its neighbors in the region. Do you think that's true? And if so, is Iran looking to form an entirely different axis in this front?
Thank you very much for inviting me. When Iran says it wants to have a good relationship with its neighbors, it means these relationships in a different setup and different framework, because the problem is that the neighbors have been hosting or facilitating United States attack and endless pressure on Iran. So now with United States having changed its position in the region and having been damaged in a military way, and the possibility of rebuilding its destructed bases is lower than before, Iran hopes that the neighbors and especially the Persian Gulf countries understand the new balance of forces, and Iran is like opening his embrace to rebuild those kind of relationships. That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything else, because Iran has never been trying to attack or endanger the security of the region. It's been the Persian Gulf countries who've been hosting United States military bases. And so I think after that 39 days and the damages which both Iran took, but also these countries took, I think there's hope for a new understanding that in the absence or in the weakening of America's position, Iran can directly reconstruct its relationship with UAE, with Qatar, with Saudi, Kuwait, and other countries.
Okay. I mean, because, Ali, there's an issue many are talking about how Iran is kind of maneuvering. And there are some saying that if done right, Iran can really come out the good guy here. But then there are others that are saying, no, Iran is already overplaying its hand by destabilizing global trade as heavily as has been done in the Strait of Hormuz. What do you think?
First of all, what Iran has done is absolutely within its within international law, because the part of the Strait of Hormuz used for navigation is within Iran's territorial waters. So Iran hasn't done anything beyond its scope of obligations. It is United States which has imposed a blockade which is absolutely against international law and has endangered the navigation. In addition to that, remember that Mr. Araghchi said the Strait of Hormuz is open, and it was Donald Trump who continued the blockade of Hormuz illegally. And after that, we don't have to go centuries and centuries behind. We just need to go 55, 56 days ago to realize all this happened because United States and Israel illegally and illegitimately attacked Iran, assassinated its leader, who was not only a political leader, but also a spiritual leader. So the United States has brought this instability to the region. And it's important to realize
that. We do. I mean, we all know how this started, but we are where we are now. And let me come back to Colonel Wilkerson, because the issue now is that obviously everyone is suffering for what has been done. And the Strait of Hormuz, Iran can say it's open, but was open with a lot of conditions, including a $2 million price tag to get your ship through for the weeks that it was able to get those ships through. So, Colonel Wilkerson, I mean, what kind of pressure then must, Gulf and other U.S. allies really exert now? Because they are struggling. The UAE, for example, is not a friend of Tehran, but their tourism economy and, natural resource exports are suffering miserably. If this turns into a protracted conflict, they're in serious trouble. So what kind of pressure should they be putting either as a unified body on Iran and the U.S. or to make this change?
Let me go back to one of Ali Vaez's comments. I have to make a comment in response. I agree with him. And one of the reasons I put Abbas Araghchi and Sergei Lavrov and Wang Yi together is because they do not deviate from their leaders' wishes. That's part of their power in their diplomacy. The Law of the Sea Treaty is very, very specific about waters such as the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Sea of Okhotsk, you name it. We haven't even brought that up, and the UN should be feeling guilty that it hasn't brought that up, because the Law of the Sea Treaty has a very specific definition for key straits, like these straits, and a very specific rationale about where international waters are, where territorial waters are, where economic zones are, and so forth. We should be consulting that, even though the U.S. is not a signatory there too, stupidly so in my view. We tried to bring it up when we were in the Secretary's office at Foggy Bottom, and the Senate simply wouldn't entertain it, but it should be brought up and it should be approved. We haven't even talked about that.
But
there
I
is
think
a
because,
mechanism that the UN could use in
Wilkerson,
terms of international law to do something about this and to do it in accordance with the various states' wishes.
What we have talked about before, though, on various...
I had with President Ahmadinejad in New York at the UN General Assembly when I was given the writ to talk him into an incidents at sea agreement. And he looked at me, and in Farsi, translated for me, he said, let's see who the problem is here. Iran has 1,875 kilometers on the Persian Gulf, and the United States has 0. So who's the problem in the Persian Gulf? Well, the way you deal with that is international law.
Okay, yeah. I mean, Ali, you know we've spoken at length on this program as well about the complete disrespect for international law. It would be the easiest answer to everything if it were respected, especially given what the United States has done in attacking Iran outright with Israel. That was, most will claim, an illegal war. It never went through even basic congressional approval, much less, adhering to any sort of international law. So, yeah, this is, what are we even dealing with here if we're actually looking at, let's just look at where the law stands, where the Strait of Hormuz actually lies as far as maritime rights are concerned. That's a lost cause, is it not?
Well, I do believe that it's too late for that. We are where we are, and there's been plenty of violation of international law by all sides. Now the question is, can we find a solution that would be mutually beneficial and would, I have to point out, help the global south, because this blockade, double blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is creating serious food shortages for countries like in East Africa, and in which you might end up having more people lose their lives than has been the case in the region as a result of this war. So this problem would have to be resolved sooner or later, and it has to be resolved within a framework that is in line with international conventions. And this is why, again, I do believe a solution that would allow the region maybe to recover from this war, because nobody is going to pay reparations to Iran. Nobody is going to pay reparations to the Gulf states. But if you have a setup which allows for a temporary period of time for both sides to be able to collect transit fees and recover from this war, and that solution is basically endorsed by the UN Security Council, that would supersede international law and the convention on a UN convention for the law of the seas. But it also has to be temporary, because you don't want to set a precedent for the Strait of Malacca or other critical choke points in the world.
Yeah, Ali, very quickly, because we only have a few minutes left, and I also needed to bring, there's another factor here that could complicate this even more so, which seems impossible given how complicated it already is. But Lebanon is now being hit as badly as ever in spite of a ceasefire. We've got over 1 million people displaced now internally. And now you have Hezbollah outright rejecting any form of talks with Israel and saying they will continue to fight on, which the president of Lebanon is calling treason. Could just that situation derail any potential progress in seeking peace in the Strait of Hormuz and between Iran and the U.S.?
This situation has more than one fuse. One fuse, of course, is friction that you might have because of the blockades. Any shot fire, any interdiction, any seizure could result in a return to the conflict. But the second fuse is Lebanon, and it's already going off. And even if we can find a solution for the double blockade to be lifted, which, by the way, could be done with both sides lifting the blockade at the same time, that would have met the conditions of the ceasefire that the Pakistanis had negotiated a few weeks ago. You would still not meet the conditions now because of the ongoing conflict in Lebanon. So this is why the Iranians are proposing a different sequence in negotiations, in which the fate of the strait is put first before we can get to other issues, including the region and the fate of their nuclear program or sanctions relief.
Okay, Alizadeh, go ahead.
So going back to the Strait of Hormuz and connecting it to Lebanon, because, I mean, we are talking as if Iran has been like creating or imposing suffering, whereas, I mean, it is Iran's main leverage in order to prevent the war coming back to Iran, because we know that Israel hasn't been satiated from degrading Iran's capability, and they will continue putting pressure on Washington to reignite the war. And so asking Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz is basically asking Iran to open itself to another round of war in a month's time, in 4 months' time, or in 6 months' time. So if the region and global kind of powers in general want a more stable Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf, I think they should start finding channels, meaningful channels, to put pressure on the United States to harness and constrain Israel from pushing for another war. I think that's exactly what Macron said 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that putting pressure and military threat on Iran is not the way to open the Strait of Hormuz. We need to have channels for dialogue and communication and understanding with Iran. And I think that was towards the end of the war. Unfortunately, from the beginning of ceasefire, people, especially European countries, are changing their tone and language, and they are putting more pressure on Iran rather than putting the pressure on Washington. I think that's the same thing. And you were talking about like Iran creating misery on the region. I mean, look at the UAE enjoyed from the misery of sanctions on Iran for 15, 20 years. From every single dollar came bypassing sanctions, UAE benefited about 20, 30 pence from that, cents from that. So many of these countries benefited from the United States putting pressure on Iran through sanctions for 2 decades. And now I think they're paying a small price for that. If they, I mean, as Iranians have made it clear, there is either peace and security for all or for none.
Okay, that will unfortunately have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all 3 of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.